We're going to look in particular at a detail of how you can use maps, historic maps, as a key to understanding current situations, and in fact use them to explore. High school teachers, college teachers, postdoctorates, everyone is beginning to realize how this can be used in the work that they do. It's become particularly important in African history, but it's not unique to African history. It's very crucial as a new approach to what might be called the transatlantic history. We could apply this to places in the New World, to the Caribbean islands, to St. Augustine down in Florida, the first permanent settlement of the Spanish on the mainland America. All of these areas are subject to a new kind of archaeology that could be enhanced by, encouraged by, and in fact informed in great detail by these early maps. And that's what historians are beginning to recognize around the world at this point. They're looking at it in projects like this in the History Design Studio over at Harvard: rivers, coastlines, islands, and the long ocean voyage, historical maps, and the study of the Atlantic trade. We've seen how we could look into the history of the Gambia, for example, in great detail by calling up current images from space of the Gambia and overlaying them with historical maps that have been digitized and placed on top of them for viewing. And we've looked into that with some detail. But let's in fact see what it means for something like this island, for looking into particular structures that are so massive they would have left an archaeological remain that could be excavated at this point. Places like this, the Island of Gouri, off the current country of Senegal, have enormously rich histories and could be examined in detail. If you have the chance to do it, it's worth getting into Google Earth and exploring this material on your own. We've seen how we can access things like the maps off the Gold Coast and how we can zero in on this particular fort that shows up in a 1746 map and learn a great deal about the structure by walking around in it. In fact, you can call up the vistas and jump right into the central courtyard, taking a look around, walking through the stairways. It's a very intricate structure and very, very studyable by archaeologists and social historians who want to look at this in length. But let's take a look at some places like the Island of Gouri, which are accessible as well. If you go at it from here, you can actually take a trip and parachute in to the Island of Gouri. Now, the Island of Gouri is extraordinarily important. It's part of this historical effort here in the Historical Maps Project. You can find out more about that in the African Historical Graphics Archive. But independent of that archive, you can use Google Earth and its web application now without any specialized software. All you need is, as it were, the browser. It works in a Chrome browser in such a way that you can manipulate the U.S. Navy's image. You can zoom in, do a 360 flyby of it if you like, or call it up in the form of a 2D picture and then work around it, you can, in fact, zoom in to various levels and even see if there is a street view. Some of these places have a street view. There it is. In fact, it's very informative if you start to look at it. Take a look. If you dive in even further, you see you're taken to the ramparts on the upper side of this fort, and you can see all the guns again are aimed at each other, that is, the European rivals, and keeping strong this fortress for, in this case, the Dutch in the first instance, and then the French after that. The English take it over for a short period of time too, but you can actually walk around the interior of this fort to some extent and find out. If you exit the photosphere, you can enter at a different place. You can zoom in a bit closer and ask for the street view and start to penetrate right down into the courtyard. See what's happening. And in fact, this has now been made into a museum for slavery. And you can learn a lot in each one of the different halls, or the old slaving rooms, you could call them that, but they were kind of dungeons for keeping the slaves. And you can walk around the exhibits that they put there for the history of Senegal and the slave trade. And prior to the slave trade, they in this museum, in fact, have a lot of material that predates the slave trade as well. You can also go into rooms like this and see in the back wall what they put up for exhibition of those very same maps that are being digitized now at Harvard. Here's a whole series of them that they've placed in this museum, reproductions of them, dating back to 1716, which was the map we were looking at, and digitized on the way in, 1723, 64, 66. You can see it's taken up right to 1984. Very impressive exhibit of this material, now available to anybody who can use these digitized maps through the mapping project that's been set up. If we look elsewhere in Africa, we can in fact zoom out of here and back over to the Gold Coast, or what is now Ghana, and look at places like these castles. Very impressive structures. They're not easily blown over, although some of them are threatened at this point, as is the case in the instance of the Gambia, where that island in the river of Gambia is so close to sea level that it will probably be engulfed in the next few decades by, in effect, rising sea level. But these structures are likely to be around for a while, and you can walk around them. These are massive. If you take a look at them from down on the beach outside, you can take a look and see that it took enormous amounts of manpower to build these things, right? These aren't going to be blown away in a big storm. They're there. They're right on the beach, but they're extraordinary. And it leads to the question very quickly, how were they built? What's the architecture behind them? Were the Europeans involved in building castles in Europe, brought down here to supervise the slave labor that was put to work here? What happened then in the New World, where similar fortresses were put up, again to defend against different groups that were trying to gain control of the trade. When you look at the architecture of the New World forts, were they the same architects that were involved in this material? Were they the same people? Ask yourself, were they the same slaves that were employed? Were the slaves first employed to build the castles here in the Gold Coast and then exported as labor to build the castles and fortresses in the Caribbean and the Americas? Very interesting set of problems that we can now bring into focus if we look one after another at the archaeology of these kinds of places. We've seen, in effect, the different possibilities. What about areas where there were no forts at all because there were nothing substantial to build on? Places like Abidjan and the Ivory Coast have no fortress structures on them, in fact no permanent structures until the 20th centuries. So the archaeology of this kind of region is very different. But you can see at this point we can just start the archaeological project and bring it into focus in such a way that people can take it on as a major new enterprise in African history. We're going to be trying to do that as a series of projects in the future, but in particular we want to look at the ways in which the space technology can inform a new kind of African history in this regard. So we're looking at old maps, picks and shovels, steps towards an archaeology of the Atlantic slave trade. Was it the kings who hauled the craggy blocks of stone? I don't think so. But that's what we're beginning to discover in the rivers, coastlines, islands, and long ocean voyages as a matter of archaeology, in assistance with these maps now digitized on the Earth's surface. Thank you very much. See you next week.